Ah, I found you. Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Malignant Young Pog died inside my chest, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. So, I'm a little bit late, but I do have the game Wesley versus Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, taken from yesterday, and it is from round 11. So, they haven't started today yet, so, I mean, it's not too bad, but, you know, they do have, I think, rounds like 14 through 19 or something like that. I don't know. They have a bunch of rounds that are going on today. But for all my people from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na? Masaya ko magkita muli. Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking video. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by and taking a look at my stuff. Anybody who is coming from Azerbaijan, I will say salam to you and chak sagol. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Assalamu alaikum to anybody in the Muslim world. Appreciate you guys very much. If you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. So we got e4, e5, knight comes to f3, we got knight to c6, bishop to c4, we got bishop to c5, we got c3, knight to f6, and then we do have d4. So we have the Juco piano, and it is the center attack. So it's not the, you know, the typical like Juco pianissimo with d3. You know, we got a little bit more of an aggressive variation on the board. So the pawn takes on d4, and you push e5. You know, it's a very typical theoretical, Zweichenzoek move. So we do have d5, a counter Zweichenzoek move. We got bishop to b5. We see knight to e4. Pawn takes d4, and then that backs the bishop up to b6. We see knight to c3. We got castles by black. Bishop comes to e3. We do have bishop to d7, and then we have bishop down to d3. Now, if we back up, some of you guys might be wondering, okay, we're in this position. It just really looks like this pawn is hanging. Like, what's wrong with taking it, right? Well, that's a great question if you've asked that. It actually ends up in kind of a tough situation for white. The main point is you're not castled with your king, so your king is still stuck in the center of the board. So that's why we see bishop to d3. But let's say we do take the pawn on d5, right? It seems free. You're actually going to be looking at bishop to a5 with check. You know, you're looking at some... it's kind of rough in this particular situation. This bishop is undefended. You are being attacked, so you don't really too much want to go back with the knight, because the knight's going to take, and then pawn, and then the bishop is going to take, and you're going to be losing in exchange. So we don't want that. So the king is pretty much forced to f1. And then you would actually have the in-between move, knight takes e5. Like I said, this bishop is undefended. So, you know, you're going to probably take back with the bishop on d7. The knight takes back. And as you can see, you know, black has gotten their pawn back, and also they have left you with an isolated d-pawn. Which, you know, it's not the end of the world, but it's not the type of position that you really want to be in. So, like I said, bishop does come back to d3. And this does allow, you know, a possibility of taking, you know, the knight on e4 with really no, like, you know, repercussions. So after bishop to d3, we actually see bishop to a5, and this is the novelty of the game. You know, it's pretty similar to the position that we saw a minute ago, but just with some slight differences. But we see rook to c1, you know, just to try to make sure that if the knight takes, you know, we can take back with the pawn here, and we do have it supported with the rook. So we have f6. You know, as you guys know, I mean, you usually have like a c5 or an f6, f5 pawn break that usually comes to try to break down white's structure, because as of right now, you know, white does have a really, really nice structure in the middle of the board. You know, they have these nice pawns and stuff set up. So black's goal is to try to get rid of those, you know, get rid of that nice center that white has. So queen comes to b3, you know, double attacking, you know, this pawn here. Well, really single attacking it at the moment, because the bishop is pinning this knight down. We have knight takes c5, pawn takes c5. And then pawn takes e5, and then we actually do see queen takes d5 with check. The king side steps over to h8. We see knight takes e5, bishop to f5, queen takes d8, rook a takes d8, knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, bishop takes f5, rook takes f5, and then we have king to e2. And I mean, you know, white is really just up a pawn. So, I mean, this was definitely a variation where white was able to just grab a pawn. And they don't really have, you know, anything wrong with, you know, having the pawn, really. You know, they just literally have the extra pawn. There aren't any tactics in the position for black to try to exploit. You know, of course, the king is kind of stuck behind this bishop, so maybe there's some pins that might be coming up. But, you know, when you look at the difference, you know, white has a really nice pawn structure. They do have an isolated pawn and some hanging pawns here. But, I mean, you know, they're definitely looking a lot better than, you know, black. And plus, they're, like I said, they are down a pawn as well. So this is definitely white's game from what we're seeing. So we see king to g8. We got c4 by white. And we have actually reached a point in the game. If you do want to pause the video and see what, you know, it's like I said before, you know, white is definitely in the driver's seat. You know, they are very much ahead. But, you know, there is a nice principled move that black has in the position. So go ahead and pause it and see if you can find this move. Okay, so, you know, you guys hear me talk a lot about, like, when you have weaknesses in your position, you always want to try to look at your position and see, like, what are your weaknesses and try to see how you can try to get rid of them. Well, you know, the major weakness in black's position is these doubled pawns here, right? With, of course, the front one being the c6 pawn. You know, what better way to try to get rid of it than to push it? It does allow, you know, white to take back with the protection of this bishop. But, you know, you can kind of put some pressure on black a little bit. So if you guess c5, that would be a really good move. I mean, every single situation is different. You know, you always want to look at each individual situation with your own, like, you know, understanding of the position, but then also, you know, be looking at, you know, like the individual, like, instances, like the nuances of the position. But a lot of the times when you see a weakness, you know, there's usually kind of like typical ways you can try to get rid of it. So, you know, pushing the pawn is definitely doing a lot better. You're trying to actually give white an isolated pawn as well here, you know, if you're able to take care, bishop take, stuff like that. But we do have white taking on c5. The rook comes over to e8 because, like I said before, there's that pin with this bishop. We see rook h to d1 trying to activate the rook. Rook takes on c5. You know, of course, we don't have to worry about, you know, the bishop taking because it is pinned, like I said. So we actually see rook to d5. And then we see bishop back to b6. And we're trying to, you know, see if the rook takes, the bishop takes. And then, you know, we have some possibilities right here. We see king up to d3. So that's, you know, getting rid of at least one pin or the pin. Something that was actually really nice in the position, you know, that actually gives black a nice little fight is actually rook takes d5. And then after pawn takes d5, rook would come to e5, throwing an attack on that pawn. The rook would come to d1 and then bishop to b6. And as you guys can see, I mean, there's quite a bit of pressure, you know, between the rook and the bishop and stuff like that. So, you know, it definitely gives black a nice, a little bit better of a fight. But like I said, we do see king to d3. We see rook up to c6. We got c5. And bishop comes back down to a5. We got rook up to c4. And something I want you to notice as far as white is concerned is how they're moving their rooks. You also had, instead of rook to c4, you also had rook to d7 as a possibility. But, you know, notice that black has a dark square bishop and white is making sure that they move their rooks on light squares. This is something like once you've been pinned, you know, once you've had your rooks, like, you know, like skewered by a bishop at some point in the past, you get very aware of where you're placing your rooks when the opponent has a certain colored bishop. So that's why you'll see these rooks like kind of navigating around like light squares. You got rook over to f6. You got rook up to d7. Bishop comes down to e1, forces f3. Rook comes up to f7. So it's not forcing a trade, but, you know, it's beneficial to go into the trade. So rook takes f7, king takes f7. We got rook over to a4. a5, which is like the only saving move for the most part. I mean, you can always like move the rook over, but, you know, you're going to be pushing this pawn here. And, you know, you're going to have some blocking abilities and stuff like that over here. So we got a5, a rook to f4 with check. We see king to g6. Rook comes to g4 with check. We see king back to f7. Rook comes to d4. We see bishop to b4. Rook comes up to d7 with check. Rook to e7. Rook takes e7. King takes e7. You got bishop to d4. So, I mean, you know, black and white they're just pretty much trying to pick on whatever like slight weaknesses that each other might have in their position. So, you know, of course, we're going to try to go after this pawn. So we see g6, which is the most principled move because, you know, you're trying to put because each side has a dark square bishop, you're trying to put your pawns on light squares so that basically you have movability with your own bishop, but then the opponent doesn't have the ability to attack your pieces. So bishop comes to c3. We see bishop takes c5, bishop takes a5. King to d6, we see king to c4, bishop down to g1, and then, you know, white does the same thing that black did. They put their pawn on h3. You see h5. We got bishop to c3. We see king to c6, bishop to d4. Like, hoping that we can get a trade. I mean, if we do get into a situation where these bishops trade, you definitely have a favorable endgame that you're going to be playing as white. You know, these three pawns are going to, like, effectively be able to take, you know, take on these two pawns over here. So we see bishop to h2. We are trying to free up our king to move a little bit, so this bishop is protecting this pawn. We see a4, bishop to d6. We see bishop to c3. Bishop down to g3. We see bishop to d2. We see h4, bishop to g5. Now, I mean, this position is very much fixed on this side over here. So, you know, we're kind of playing over here a little bit. So the king comes to b6. We see king to d5. King to a5. We see king to e6. King takes a4. King comes up to f7. You know, one of the things also about putting your pawns on the opposite color square is that your bishop doesn't have the ability to protect it. So that was part of the reason that bishop to g5 came, because not only are we tying the bishop down to this pawn, but we're also trying to make it so where this bishop doesn't move, so the king at some point can come over and try to attack it, which is what it's doing. And then also, very importantly, this bishop to g5 you know, square is actually holding the queenie square of this pawn. So that's something else that's important. So we got c5, king takes g6, we got c4, f4, c3, we have f5, and then we have c2. And it is actually in this position that Shakhriyar Mamedyarov does resign the game, because as you guys can see, I mean, there is just no way to force this pawn down without sacrifices, you know, like, well, I mean, you're not going to be sacrificing anything, but I mean, the king definitely needs to try to help. The bishop doesn't really have any way to affect this square because the bishop is cutting it off. This bishop at some point is going to have to try to come up. So, I mean, like, for example, if we continue to play on, you know, white is going to push their pawn. And then, I mean, if you have to try, you know, if you try to get the king down here, I mean, you're going to have this situation. This bishop is going to have to come so that it can protect this square. But, I mean, you know, you're not going to do that. You know, the king is just going to come up. This king will come down. You'll force this pawn through. The bishop will take. And then, I mean, you have the ability to just sacrifice your bishop. And then you're going to come down into a winning in-game situation. Something like this. And then once this pawn goes, you know, you're going to be able to step and you're going to have a favorable situation. This king is not going to be able to come around. And that's just a sample. Like, I mean, there's many different ways, but this king is not going to be able to come around to affect this queenie square because it's just not going to, it's going to never be able to be in the square of that pawn. So that is that. But taking us back to the position that we had, like I said, we did have this as the final position after c2. So yeah, that was a pretty nice game. You know, it's interesting because it just seemed kind of subtle. Like, it didn't seem like, you know, either side really had like a major advantage, but it's just like Wesley So was able to just kind of slowly build up, you know, the position. And that's usually what happens in a chess game. It's usually, you know, you're playing somebody and it's not like a major catastrophic event happens. It's usually just like small maneuvering that kind of builds up over time, and then you just figure out you're in a lost position. So yes. So for my people in the Philippines, to get these good mornings real quick. So maanyong buntag, mayad na agahan, naibag na bigat, masantos ya kabosan, marhe na aga, buenos dias, maanyong aga, mapia na uma, kapian kapuno dias. Did I say that right? I think I did. Yeah. Kapian kapuno dias, mayapa abak, mayad na aga, mapia agay, mapia kapa pizza, my big abukla, marjana buntag, marya may nat, malpe na aga, kasanyangan si alabi. Merci, salam, assalamu alaikum to you. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by, and I will see y'all next time. Makita tayo mamaya.